Andrew, should I start? What do you
Yeah,
think?
it's 1:06. Let's get started.
Perfect. Okay, well, welcome everybody to this virtual space that we are organizing from LACE, Los Angeles Contemporary Exhibitions. And first my name is Daniela Lieja Quintanar, and I'm Chief Curator and Director of Programming at LACE. And first, I want to acknowledge that LACE is located in a land that has been taken care by the Tongva people since ancestral times into the present and into the future. And also that this land, now called Los Angeles, is also a place of many migrants that has been displaced from their own homes, and that also many of them belong to indigenous groups in different parts of the world. So, On Disciplinary Tactics, Beatriz da Costa, is the title of a research and upcoming exhibition on 2024 that I am curating with the support and advice of many, many people. Among them, Robert Nideffer, who was a collaborator and partner of Beatriz, and he has been very generous with this research. Anna Rees, who is our curatorial assistant, Andrew McNeely, whose role is as curator advisor, and he's also working with the reading group. And many other artists, curators, researchers, and friends of Beatriz has generously contributed with their own experience in this project. This project is part of the PST, Pacific Standard Time, Getty Foundation Initiative, which focuses on the intersection of art and science. We are right now in the research phase of this project. And this project revisits the collaborative artistic practice of Beatriz da Costa, who worked with interdisciplinary models, public intervention, workshops, and critical writing. We are very inspired and looking into Da Costa's understanding of biopolitics, self-care, her critical research, her use of technoscience for exploring concepts of life, death, extinction, multi-species engagement, and the work of collectively sustaining life. That, like, this idea of collectively sustaining life has been also a core of how to read her work. And in syntony and with syntony of Beatriz's work, we have opened the research to the public. And last weekend, we start a preemptive study group coordinated by Andrew McNeely, friend, curator, and co-founder of the community reading group at LACA. And right now, the study group is here with us, accompanying us. And we have the fortune to have really amazing people that is going to be reading with us texts of Beatriz and other authors that relate with her work. And so we are having around 8 sessions, and every session that we have guest speakers like today, we are opening the session to other people to join us. And this is also, in inspiration of Beatriz. So I'm gonna give a little overview of Beatriz life and work, and then we'll pass it to the deep conversation with Andrew, Antoinette, and Robert, and Brooke. Juan, if you wanna put the presentation, we have a few visuals. So Beatriz was an interdisciplinary artist and tactical media practitioner working at the intersection of contemporary art, science, engineering, and politics. Is there a way that you can show just like I think you have to say view slide, yeah. Or I think we're seeing like the PowerPoint. There we go, cool. If not, you're seeing my notes. Beatriz da Costa, better known as Shani by her friends and family, was born in June 11, 1974 in Berlin, Germany. She grew up in Ahrensburg, north of Germany. In 1995, and Juan, you can just move the slides while I'm talking. They don't have like a specific order. In 1995, she moved to southern France to study at École Supérieure des Arts in Aix-en-Provence. Excuse my pronunciation, where her interest on the intersection of art and technology started growing. She graduated with honors in 2001. While studying in France in 1999, as part of an exchange program, she moved to Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania at Carnegie Mellon University, where she became part of an important community of artists, activists, and intellectuals working in the intersection of robotics, biology, arts, science. Among these artists, Faith Walding, Steve Kortz, co-founder of Critical Art Ensemble, artist Simon Penny. And also in Carnegie Mellon, she met Brooke Singer and Jamie Schultz. And in 2006, the three of them create the collective Preemptive Media. They define themselves as a group of artists, activists, and technologists who are making their own style of beta tests, trial runs, and impact assessments based on independent research. Airs and Swipe were some of the projects that they developed. And also they have a very interesting text called Surveillance Script. Also in Carnegie Mellon, Beatriz developed this cello that was an automated robot that played itself. She briefly taught at Chapman College and as a visiting assistant professor of the State University of New York in Buffalo. In 2003, she moved to Southern California to be a founding member of the Arts, Computation, Engineering ACE graduate program at UC Irvine, a highly innovative, experimental, and interdisciplinary program granting a 2-year MFA MS degree. At UCI, she also was affiliated faculty in the informatic departments and the Cultural and Theory PhD program. At this unique interdisciplinary program that I know we are going to talk more about it and how it ends, Beatriz was able to be part of an important community of dedicated artists, researchers, educators, and activists, such as Antoinette LaFarge, Kavita Philip, and the other founders of the program, Simon Penny and Robert Nideffer. In 2007, Beatriz received a tenure at UC Irvine. And during her sabbatical, she decided to go to start a PhD in the History of Consciousness program at UC Santa Cruz, a program led by Donna Haraway. Da Costa collaborated with Critical Art Ensemble many times in projects such as Molecular Invasion, Free Range Grains, and Genterra. She also co-edited with Kavita Philip the book Tactical Biopolitics, Art Activism and Technoscience in 2008, a big effort to gather multiple voices from different disciplines and critical perspectives. Between 2006 and 2008, she developed Pigeon Blog with the collaboration of Humming Pigeons, students from the ACE program, Kevin Ponto and Sina Hasek, and Pigeon Fanciers. The pigeons carried miniature GPS and pollution sensors, an experiment to collect data for the community in an autonomous way. Beatriz was known as a determined, very well articulate and opinionated person, as well as a very creative and generous friend. Beatriz passed away on December 27 of 2012 in New York after a long fight to cancer. her last years, she developed the series The Cost of Life, who also was awarded with a Creative Capital grant, where she used her experience as a person living with cancer, but without centering on herself. This work, who also is like a big inspiration for undisciplinary tactics, sparks a deep reflection about life as not only human-centered, but in relation with the environmental issues and health, and also inspires to focus on the autonomy to generate our own scientific research for a better place. Thank you, and I'll give it to Andrew.
Thank you for that, Daniela. Very quickly, I'll reintroduce myself. So my name is Andrew McNeely. I'm a writer, curator, and curatorial advisor to this, the exhibition phase, or the research phase of this exhibition project. So this is both a roundtable, but it's also quite literally the research for this exhibition. So I want to bring that to the attention of those who weren't in our first session. As you know, so this is a research phase that will be done in 2 parts. There's 8 sessions in this part, and then there will be an additional 8 sessions at a later date, which take the form of a reading group. And the main interest of this reading group is surveying the writing and projects that Beatriz undertook over the course of her life, and asking, what does it mean to bring the arts closer to the sciences? Or what does it mean to bring the qualitative questions that the arts ask and bring them closer to the quantitative questions that the sciences ask? And so with that in mind, we are extremely excited to have Brooke, Robert, and Antoinette with us today, who are artists who all work in a sort of dizzying array of different disciplines. And I will try to cover all of them in the introduction. But to help us get a grasp of, what were some of the challenges that Beatriz faced in being an interloper between 2 different worlds. So with that, I want to introduce them. So the first person I'll introduce is Robert. So Robert F. Nideffer, and apologies because I'm not entirely precisely sure of the correct pronunciation of Nideffer, but Robert F. Nideffer is an artist and faculty member in the Department of Art and the Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute, where he teaches in both the electronic arts as well as the game simulation arts and sciences program. Before joining the RPI in 2013, Robert was a core faculty member and served as director of the Arts Computation and Engineering program at the University of California, Irvine that Daniela just mentioned, which is a unique partnership between UCI School of the Arts, School of Engineering, and the School of Information and Computer Science. ACE, as the program would come to be known, and to which Beatriz was a key participating faculty member, was unusual in that it built bridges across what are conventionally seen as incommensurable areas of study, one qualitative and the other quantitative. Beyond scholarly activities, Robert is an accomplished artist, having exhibited his work at the Museo Nacional Centro de Arte in Spain, the Laguna Art Museum in Laguna Beach, California, the Museum of Modern Art in New York, and the 2002 Whitney Biennial, among others. Antoinette LaFarge is an artist and writer and professor of new media art at the University of California, Irvine, where she currently serves as the director of the digital arts minor in the School of the Arts. Antoinette co-developed the new media area at UCI with Robert, as well as working with Beatriz and Robert in the ACE program. As an artist, Antoinette's work has taken the form of computer-mediated performance, programmed installation, and digital prints. Her work has been shown at museums, galleries, and theaters in the United States and abroad, including the Venice Biennale, the California Museum of Photography, the European Media Arts Festival, and the New York International Fringe Festival, among others. In addition to art, Antoinette is widely published, having debuted her most recent book, Sting in the Tail, Art, Hoax, and Provocation, with Doppelhaus Press in 2021, which is an illustrated survey of artist hoaxes, including personations, fabula, cryptoscience, and forgeries. And finally, Brooke Singer is an artist, writer, and associate professor of new media at Purchase College, State University of New York. From 2002 to 2008, Brooke, along with Beatriz and engineer Jamie Schulte, founded Preemptive Media, a collective dedicated to pioneering new opportunities for public discussion around emerging technologies, not led by business or government. Brooke's independent work lives, quote, on and quote, offline in the form of websites, workshops, photographs, maps, installations, public art, and performances that involve participation in pursuit of social change. She has exhibited nationally and internationally at institutions such as MoMA PS1, the Warhol Museum of Art, the Banff Center, Neuberger Museum of Art, Diverse Works, and Matadero Madrid. And from 2018 to 2020, she was a research affiliate with the Groffman Research Group Environmental Sciences Initiative, Advanced Scientific Research Center at the Graduate Center at the City University of New York. So please, I know it's weird in the virtual space, but let's please welcome Robert, Antoinette, and Brooke. So I wanted to begin by getting a sense of who Beatriz was as a person. I'm curious to know if you three could share with us maybe an anecdote that you recall from when you knew her, maybe how you first met her, or your general impression of her as a person. Maybe Robert, you want to begin?
Yeah, hi everyone. Thank you all for organizing this. That's a tough one to start with. She was complex, you know, and I remember, I think the first time I met her is when Simon Penny, so, you know, you've mentioned the ACE program. I was on the search committee that brought Simon to campus to really, he was really the founder and kind of main brain behind the art computation engineering program. I was involved as a faculty member, but my involvement in the role of director happened several years later after it was all started by Simon, Beatrice, and Bill Tomlinson. So yeah, she, you know, was, I don't want to go too far down this path, but ACE was really the brainchild of the Dean of Engineering at the time. He had an FTE, which is basically a faculty position, and he had a conversation with the Dean of the School of the Arts and thought it would be really interesting to do something between art and engineering. And the Dean of the School of the Arts, a woman named Jill Beck, was really supportive and a real go-getter. And so that was kind of the genesis of what became the ACE program. And that was the position that was used to hire Simon. And the first round of hiring that Simon was able to do was to bring in a couple of junior faculty. So a lot of people were interviewed, and two of those were Bill Tomlinson and Beatriz da Costa. And Beatriz had this history that Andrew and Daniela had mentioned at Carnegie Mellon. Please let me know if my sound is cutting out or if it's okay so far. It's good.
Oh,
okay,
you're perfect.
Okay, awesome. It was cutting out a little earlier, so I was worried. And, you know, Carnegie Mellon, it was, you know, we hear about it from a distance out west. It was kind of a special moment. There are a lot of really great people there. You mentioned some of them. And so, yeah, there's a whole history there, but, you know, Beatrice and Simon knew each other from CMU. And so she came out and interviewed, but really the interview, so I was brought in because she was split between the School of Engineering. The official appointment was 50% engineering, 50% art. So she was kind of interviewing in both schools, both departments. And when she came over to the arts, I remember walking into the chair's office at the time and sitting down, and it was pretty intense. It was more like she was interviewing us than we were interviewing her. And I was really struck by, you know, the questions she was asking, the seriousness, and yeah, she left quite an impression, even in just that first initial moment. The other moment I was thinking about was toward the end of her life, when she'd already moved to New York and found a small apartment in the city right near NYU in Washington Square Park. And she was in treatment at the time at Sloan Kettering. And I was out west still We shared a house together. And so at that point, I was still teaching and she was still teaching, but she'd set it up so she could teach remote. And I was going back and forth quite a bit between LA and New York. And she started talking about wanting to get a dog. And I was like, we'd had a cat. It took me like 3 years to convince her to get a cat in the place that we lived. And finally, for my birthday, she let me get a cat. But she, of course, picked out the cat. And then during that time, I don't think, she ever changed the litter box or anything once. I was thinking, God, a big, a dog in New York. Are you sure that's a good idea? And I was a little bit kind of skeptical, and she wasn't too happy about that. And she had this, she'd really done research. It was going to be a service animal. She didn't know how long she had to live at that point. She was afraid that she didn't have enough time to wait to get a service animal donated. It would take like at least a year before she'd be able to get one officially. And so she'd research breeds. And this was also part of the mix where she was working on the PhD at Santa Cruz, Donna Haraway, and starting to really get, and Donna had, a lot of people may not know this, but Donna had like a national champion dog that she would do agility course training with. It was like really amazing. And so anyway, one thing led to another. She found this dog, and it was the best thing that she ever could have done. It ended up, it was a whole other side of her came out in relation to this animal that I hadn't really witnessed. And yeah, so my concern, my skepticism was kind of dead wrong. And I think it was one of the best decisions she could have made at that point in her life to get this done. I still, it's laying here behind me now, totally untrained at the moment. I've let it go, kind of feral, but so.
Thank you for that. Brooke or Antoinette, do one of you want to go next?
Okay, I'll go because I'm smiling because I had somewhat the same reaction when she talked about getting a cat that you had when she talked about getting a dog. I think we had an argument about that, in fact. We all knew different Beatrices. Because Robert and Beatrice lived in Long Beach, where I live, and we hung out a fair amount for dinners and beach walks, and I did yoga with her and things like that. So it was hard picking out one thing, but one of the things that really has stayed as a warm memory is one time her mother came over from Germany to visit, and we we're all having dinner together. And I was used to thinking of Shawnee as a very serious person, a very focused, intense, critical, judgmental person. And I don't mean that necessarily negatively. I'm a judgmental person myself. And I didn't often see her in relaxed mode, but that evening I did. And moreover, she taught, we decided to play Yahtzee that night, a card game, which I had never played. It somehow missed my childhood. And she took great glee in teaching me how to play Yahtzee. And that's another reason that I remember it, because in general, she was somewhat dismissive of Robert Nideffer's and my interest in games. And so it was kind of enchanting to play a game with her. And she was very lighthearted that night. And it was that lighthearted person that I seldom saw that is probably one of the reasons that I remember that evening so well.
Thank you for that. Brooke, are you still with us? Maybe, maybe not. Robert, very quickly, the dog.
Well, I have to follow Antoinette up if we have a couple minutes, because the game thing is very true. She just thought I was wasting my time studying game. Why would I, she's like, was of that mindset. I had done this PhD in sociology, so I had this social conscience, but my work wasn't really reflecting what she thought it could in terms of, being more activist oriented. And so, it's just a difference in our interests. And so I was working on this game project at the time. It was this little kind of 2D side-scrolling WoW parody that I was doing with a really talented undergrad student, and we were having a lot of fun with it. And she knew about the project. I didn't really know how much she knew about it, but it ends up, I would start getting these messages, like, this isn't working, that's not working, like, what's going on here? I'm trying to get this quest done. Ended up, she like found the URL and was playing this game. and was really getting quite good at it and became the best kind of beta tester we had. And then when my parents came for a visit, it's kind of like one of these moments Antoinette was talking about, totally unexpected. My parents came for a visit, and they were just asking about what I was doing. And so, Shani jumped up and she's going, well, I'll show you. And she plugged in the projector, it was on the wall on big screen, and she was doing this kind of play session with the game. And yeah, it was nice. It was one of those unexpected kind of playful moments that, and I guess behind that is this idea. A lot of times with Shani, you wouldn't. There was sometimes a rough exterior. She'd be prickly, like we all can, and you wouldn't know always. She wasn't very expressive about what she was feeling. A lot of the kind of innermost thoughts, but it was through her kind of action or things that would periodically come out where you realize, oh, there is this whole other side to her there that maybe you wouldn't see right away up front. Yeah, it was interesting. Is Brooke back? Brooke, your turn. I gotta shut up.
Hi, sorry, I had to run off. I locked someone out of the apartment, so excuse my exiting, but it's great to be here with everyone, and it's really touching to hear these stories and to see those pictures. And I guess Shani, it's coming up on 10th year since her passing, so my memory is kind of foggy, but it's, there are definitely very strong kind of recollections of the times when we collaborated together, and it was an intense 6 or 7 years. The three of us, Jamie Schulte and Shani and myself as Preemptive Media, and Heidi Kumau joined us for one project for Zapped. And it all began at Carnegie Mellon, this magical moment. I was in graduate school and Shani was an exchange student and taking a lot of graduate level classes. And I think we were in the same, kind of critical theory course for graduate art students. And Carnegie Mellon is a place I've tried to emulate at places at Purchase and other places I've taught and been part of in terms of interdisciplinary collaboration, because it was just a wonderful kind of open door policy, very informal. Of I think it was mostly student led, but maybe professor encouraged or allowed, where we would wander from the art building into the design studios, and human and computer interaction was becoming a thing. This was early 2000s, and definitely we were hanging out a lot in the robotics labs where Jamie was doing work, and there was something like a Mars rover that we would check in on and gawk at, and it was a really exciting time. So it was also, we had these wonderful models of critical art ensemble. Steve Kurtz was one of our professors, and then collaborator and friend, and the Institute for Applied Autonomy was happening, which some of you are probably familiar with, and Jamie was working with that group, and eventually Preemptive Media. Sub Rosa was strong and quite a force, and hanging out with those folks. And it was really Beatriz who I was quite happy being in the mix, but doing my own independent work. And she was adamant that we start this collective and we do work together. And it was a first for me in that kind of environment. And it's a way of working that I have continued in, for 2 decades now. So, she very persuasive person, opinionated came up. She had strong opinions, but they were really interesting and smart and well-researched and articulated. And she also, was open and to be convinced otherwise too. It wasn't so kind of, entrenched by any means. And I guess, thinking about kind of one aspect of Shani that was always remarkable to me, and I'd never quite met a person like her, when I met her, and I haven't really since, is her dedication to her work. And literally everything was given to her work, 150%. And it got us into crazy situations where, you know, there's a lot of big thinking. I was like, is that possible? But, you know, just like maybe the dog that Robert was referring to, like, it seems impossible, or the PhD at that moment in her life, but nothing was going to stop her, and she would figure out how to make it happen, even though there were, I remember once being in New York waiting for Shani. We were going to catch a flight to Brazil, to Sao Paulo the next day, and she's coming in from the West Coast, and she arrived without her passport. She'd left it on the plane. So I had to go for this. We were doing air at that time, and I had to go on my own with this extremely complex project. Technologically, it had a lot of participation involved. There's a lot of, you know, parts that had to make it over international flights. For those of you who've done that before, that's quite stressful. And she promised me she would be there within 48 hours. She would figure it out. And lo and behold, she did. She went into the consulate's office and got some emergency passport, and she was there in Brazil within 48 hours. I also remember, this is kind of an extreme, another situation where we drove to Toronto, I think from Buffalo, and we're giving a talk together, and she didn't feel well when she got up with me. And I said, well, sit down and, you know, I'll do this, you know, I can do the thing and take over your part. And she said, no, we're going to do it as planned, and I'll let this plane pass. And through the talk, I could see her struggling and catching her breath. And she was adamant to get through it. And at the end, I was adamant that we get into the car and go back to Buffalo and see a doctor. And I believe her lung collapsed in the middle of that talk, something quite extreme. But Shani was one who was going to get through and do the thing that she wanted to do, even if it was extremely painful or difficult. And it was kind of crazy. It was definitely crazy, but it was terrifically admirable. And we got an invitation to go to Regina, Saskatchewan in the middle of February. And I said, no way am I going to the middle of the tundra in February, but we did. So, you know, that's kind of her determination, and just really giving herself 150% to her work, and making things happen that she believed in, and despite the odds or any barriers that were put up in her way. So I think I'll leave it at that.
Thank you for that. I'm curious to know if Beatrice's interest in science and technology is something that she carried with her from childhood, or if that's something that really developed while in her studies at Carnegie Mellon. What was her work prior to the work that she made later in her life like? I mean, did she begin as a sculptor, a painter? I'm not sure if anyone could speak to that.
I believe that Carnegie Mellon was the place where the technology and the collaboration and the political kind of conversation and discourse came into play. I think she's mostly sculpture and maybe video and installation prior to Carnegie Mellon, but Robert, maybe you remember more clearly the previous work.
No, I think you're right, Brooke. When she was at Aix-en-Provence, it was kind of sculptural installation. She'd done painting and a little bit, but it was CMU, I think, that really, and probably the collaborative work with CAE, if that was, I mean, Brooke, you'd know better the timeline probably, since you were there at the same time, but I think that really is what kind of was a catalyst for a lot of the more kind of socially conscious, activist oriented art science work.
Yeah, definitely. And it was in the air. And I think, you know, also I think I lasted a week in Simon Penny's gizmology course, and Shani lasted the whole time through. And that's out of that class, the robotic cello mean, that was just a huge and very complicated work. And she, sought out help, and it was a solo work. But, in that context at Carnegie Mellon, there were so many brilliant brains to pick, and Simon was very influential and helpful. And then Critical Art Ensemble and these younger collaboratives like Institute for Applied Autonomy. So I also was not, I was making video, and my background prior to grad school is more photography, and, segued into net art in the kind of the mid 90s and late 90s prior to grad school. But it was, this was what was happening at Carnegie Mellon, and it was at least, around the art department. Not 100% was the most interesting thing, and we both jumped in, and that was the beginning, I think, for both of us.
Cool. It was in the air. Was that a pun, given the nature of air and pigeon blog?
I guess so, or Freudian slip. I don't know. Either way.
Okay, so as you know, the topic of these sessions is bringing art closer to the sciences, and I had asked you three to read Beatrice's essay in Tactical Biopolitics, Reaching the Limit, which also our members of this group have also read. So I'm hoping that we can all engage in a very productive discussion of it when we pivot to the Q&A. But I wanted to start this conversation with a passage that I think helps us approach this question of what does it mean to bring the arts closer to the sciences in a productive way. The reason I chose this passage is because it highlights a concern that I've identified in Beatrice's writings while doing research for this project, which is the question, when does science become political? And by that question, what I don't mean is, when is science politicized for particular party, agendas, but rather, when does science enter into consensus building, world building, imagining a better future, imagining a darker future. This seems to me to be a recurrent motif in Beatrice's investment in both sciences, but also collaboration. And so I just want to read this passage and then begin to think about all of the different valences that we can attend to this question with. So in Reaching the Limit, Beatrice writes, and this is to set this up, this is her taking a postmortem, if you will, of the success of the Pigeon blog project, which has become the real main case study of this session, but also the most of the imagery for this research phase of this is drawn from the Pigeon blog project. So she writes, Pigeon blog received a lot of media coverage. Major national and international newspapers covered the project, and so had national television news channels. In nearly every instance, I was being referred to as, quote, Beatriz da Costa, researcher at the University of California, Irvine. Quote, researcher seemed to imply, quote, scientist in many people's minds, rather than, quote, creative or, quote, social or, quote, artistic researcher. Suddenly, I was put under a scrutiny and questioning similar to what scientists have to go through after publishing their work. And the association of the, quote, political techno-scientific artist, unquote, with a specific intellectual seemed to have gone one step too far. This realization and thoughts about the future of Pigeon blog made me pause for a while. Did the project lose its political potential by becoming too closely associated with the university and myself, being an actor within it? How should Pigeon blog continue? Would large amounts of money now have to be raised to conduct a, quote, scientifically sanctioned study? Wouldn't this end up creating the same trap of eventually developing expertise while becoming less accessible to a non-expert public? So For this discussion, I want to mostly focus on Pigeon Blog because there are a number of things that strike me about the way that Beatriz understood its success and problems. The first is her concern with how expertise or institutional validation neutralizes a particular kind of political engagement. But the second one that's quite interesting to me and much more nuanced is and less obvious is the question of what it means to make scientific research itself public. And I think there's a number of ways to answer that question, but I want to start by asking you all, as artists who undertake research as part of the art object, how do you think about the integration of, let's say, scientific, environmental, or technological experimentation in your respective works? Or I should say practices. Do I dare call on someone?
Can I start by just making a slight distinction?
Totally.
I think one of the overall purposes of this book was to tease out a couple different meanings of political. And so as I read that paragraph, she was talking about political, meaning, did it cease to be political in the sense, did it not have effect in how people acted in the world? Did it not have effect in how people thought about or reacted to the localized air pollution that the project was monitoring? So I think that there's evidence that she and Kavita both thought that science was always already political. It exists in a neoliberal state, right, under late capitalism, and therefore its modes of inquiry, its objects of inquiry, everything about it is always already politicized, and that the problems that high level of politicization has brought in its train is what concerned her, as well as, I think, the more sort of localized and small scale political effects of a project and its sequelae, if anyway. Maybe that's a false distinction in terms of what she would have said, but I do think that there are different forms of the politic that are at stake in her work.
Yeah, I would agree, Antoinette. And I think from the collaborations that we did with Preemptive Media, it was the recognition that science is political, whether it's recognized or spoken or not, right? And how can we enter the conversation and use the tools or enter into the scientific, techno-scientific discourse and alter those politics, right? And upend the dominant political neoliberal scientific kind of project through these interventions, and while doing that, expose kind of the conditions of the making, allow ourselves to learn them along with a public, whether it was through a workshop or the pigeon blog didn't have that kind of participatory element so much. I mean, the participation actually was with the pigeons, right? But I do think that, in terms of kind of, thinking about the kind of political discourse, it was, at least the thread I see through all of the work, was creating her own with others, whether that would be human or non-humans, right?
I agree. It's actually a major motif or a theme in the work that I want to eventually jump to. I'm not sure, Robert, if you'd like to speak to this question, or if you have some thoughts.
I have a feeling it's going to come out later, but one of the things I'm thinking about hearing, well, your question, Andrew, and Brooke, and and Antoinette's comments is conversations that I had fairly often with Simon, and when he was kind of formulating the arts computation engineering program, talking about what it is that would do. And there was this phrase that, you know, he would keep repeating that was, you know, Phil Agri at UCLA most recently, but this idea of critical technical practice. And it's sort of captures, I think, because it's a broad range of types of works that Shani did, but I think they all in a certain way fall under this rubric of a critical technical practice, which was, you know, really about trying to think about what socially conscious technology or technologists or technology creation and production look like. And, you know, if we're talking about kind of what we get out of these interdisciplinary dialogues, then I'm sure we'll kind of get back probably to this idea. But yeah, sort of combining critical and cultural theory in the making of things from a perspective that kind of is highly reflective and draws attention to what it is that you're doing, and casts things in perhaps different lights and creates new types of dialogue around it. And there's lots of, yeah, different ways that gets done. But Pigeon Blog was, I think, certainly an interesting project in that regard.
I was also struck by her question about whether she would need to go on and do more scientifically sanctioned research, or research that could stand up to a certain kind of scrutiny. And I'm wondering about the impulse, where that comes from, because it makes me think about what it is for something to be enough, to be good enough to make an effect in the world. Like, is there still a role for imperfect science, imperfect research, such as this kind of a project where there's a crack through which experts can come in and blow your stuff down? And of course, she was doing this right before the current era, when non-experts come in to blow everything down as well as experts. So there's nothing that can actually go out in the scientific realm without being challenged from many different angles. And I was thinking trying to think about this project, I was reminded of Natalie Jeremijenko's project of robotic dogs, which was a little earlier than this, but had a similar project of using sensors to pick up pollution. It was a different kind of pollution, I think, and use that information to try to create change on the ground. And I think there was some effect from that project, not big, not sustained, but the question that raises for me is whether Shani thought there simply hadn't been enough effect from this project, like it really never got beyond kind of a demonstration project stage, or whether she felt it couldn't have any real impact unless the science in it stepped up a level. And I never talked to her about that. And I don't know if either of you did, Brooke or Robert, but it makes me curious about that.
Well, I'd actually like to jump in here, because I can speak a little bit to that, because through my research and watching some of Beatriz's talks about the project, one of the things that really concerned her, well, I should say one of the things that she thought was really successful about the project is just the fact that the arts can generate publicity around issues in a way that sciences can't, or only really can in certain ways. But that's what was productive. But what she didn't like about it, and what she found, she suggests or she intimates, is something that she concerns her about the integration of art and technology, is that it generally sort of attracts a certain type of technophilia that she's was very concerned with. And I think she felt that Pigeon Blog wasn't successful in that, because all of the publicity that it did generate was just around the cool factor of the backpacks, and that the point is actually lost. And on that point, I also want to speak to or respond, Antoinette, to this other idea, or I guess maybe this was you, Brooke, who said this, and this is very much in line with preemptive media. But Antoinette, you had mentioned is there still a space for imperfect, research to be done. And what that makes me think of is a passage in this text in which one of the key areas Beatrice believes the artist can intervene is at the level of the tools where science is conducted. In thinking about alternative ways those tools might be applied to the world, or to think about how they might be creatively misapplied and what kind of insights that might generate. And that seems wholly of interest in the preemptive media. I'm not sure if you'd agree, Brooke.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And when I read that passage, I also read into it a fear of, doing this interdisciplinary work and the kind of amount of kind of technological know-how and piecing together a team to pull off a project like this that actually works and is not a speculative design project is immense. And so, you become so invested in learning the language and understanding to keep up with your collaborators, and also to bring collaborators on board and to have that support within a research university or maybe an external, technology company. That at times you might go down that, what I read in this, that she felt like maybe she went down that rabbit hole too far, and that she had to pull back out of it and remember the kind of translation and being a translator to a general public and bringing people in. And there's this like hierarchy of the arts and sciences that we all know so well. And at some point when you are so successful in the scientific and academic structures and rewards, you might start believing those hierarchies yourself, when what you've wanted to do is come in and disrupt those, and to create projects that incorporate a broader narrative or way of seeing that is not just scientific, that scientific is one in relationship to storytelling and kind of visual or local knowledge or experience, what have you. So I think there is a fear of that as well, based on that quote that you pulled, Andrew.
I do want to mention that there will be a Q&A session at the end of this. However, I see that Anu has patiently been waiting to pose a question. And so I do want to allow them the opportunity to pose it.
Thank you. And actually, the reason I'm even interjecting at all is because I was the frontline producer on that project, the Pigeon blog. So what I want to point out is that a lot of what Beatrice, I think, was responding to was the framing that we had to use to get the permission, to get the access to do things. This was a project, when we produced Pigeon Blog in San Jose, there were 150 projects in public space, and only one of them wanted access to the San Jose Museum of Art clock tower. Actually, there were two. One was Beatrice, and one was Neighborhood Public Radio. And we could not have gotten the access for Neighborhood Public Radio alone. We were able to get the access to the clock tower because it was a research project with a university behind it and all these, specialized science things, right? And that allowed us to get around certain anxieties around who's allowed to go up to the roof and can we have animals and this kind of stuff, right? Where meanwhile, doing it at the museum versus the university campus meant they didn't have to have the same controls as if this was a laboratory experiment on animals that you would have to do, that I had to deal with when I was running a university art gallery, for example, even though it had nothing to do with animal research, right? Just because someone put an animal in a show. So we had a kind of a win-win so long as the two institutions would fit together. But what this did was it institutionalized her project. And then the messaging retain that institutionalization to some extent, I would say, for a few reasons. One is because it was San Jose in 2006, and it was a frenzy of anything tech or science related that could have R&D implications for industry. So that was a big reason why the press wanted to cover it. And then I think the other thing I just wanted to add was that and that because there were 150 projects, the researcher messaging was part of how we explained the access. access, right? The ability to get things, the ability to get permissions, because she's doing research. We had other projects we had to do this with, like Symbiotica, which was they were doing genetic mutations we had to build a clean room, we had to get it certified. There was all kinds of stuff that we were doing that was bridging art and science. And I learned a lot about like what you can do and what you can't do. I think that really informed how this project went down and how it was received. And then the last thing, thank you for letting me speak, by the way. The last thing that I wanted to say is I understood pretty clearly from my interactions with Beatriz that the pigeons were independent actors in this project, which is very different from Natalie Jeremijenko's robot dogs, which are not agents of their own. The pigeons are animals. They have their own perspective. And a lot of the messaging, when I would explain it to people, was about this is the pigeon's opportunity to communicate with us and gather information that will help us to make their environment more livable for them. And so I think that kind of very like accessible messaging was very helpful in a time when we weren't really having a conversation about climate the way we are today. And the relationship, for example, between air travel and climate the way we do today in 2022. But I think anytime an artist works with a public, whether it's a human public or in this case, an animal public, it also makes it harder for them to really strongly assert their artistic agency because it's one narrative or the other. Either they're the genius artist and they control and dictate everything, or this is other entities have agency and then, oh, she's just collecting research. So I think it has a lot to do with just like how poorly we understand the work. Thank you again for letting me interject.
Quickly, Anu, one quick question is what are the, just if you could reiterate, what is the main misconception of the work? When you say
what do I think that,
yeah,
what's that?
What is like the dominant misconception of her work, of Beatriz's work?
Okay, so you know what, I think it's this idea that what she's doing is research as opposed to creative art practice, because it doesn't very strongly assert a narrative that she imposes. And excellent. I think, you know, that's I guess, yeah, that's probably the main gist of it, is that she really kind of tries to let what unfolds speak for itself. And that's not as easy to narrativize as one person's opinion.
Mm-hmm. I want to briefly ask a nuts and bolts question to Brooke, because I know that, and perhaps Antoinette and Robert, you may also speak to this, but I do know that, Brooke, something that you share with Beatriz is this self-description as a techno-scientific artist. From what I understand, that has a very specific meaning. Do you mind elaborating on that?
Oh, you know, it's not actually a term that I use so much. And rereading the chapter for today, I was kind of happy to kind of re-meet that term. But I guess, you know, one thing maybe in terms of Anu, what was saying before, you know, I would see it as both artistic practice and research, that the two are one and the same in this project, although it's not seen on the outside as it has to be defined as one or the other. And that's one thing that as a techno-scientific artist or artist as researcher, there are various terms you could use here, but I think that is one area that has gained a lot of progress in the last decade, right? This kind of recognition of art as research, and that's due to a variety of PhDs and that kind of visibility, and just more and more artists who are working collaboratively with scientists or you know, outside the discipline, or they themselves are interdisciplinary. And using tools from, you know, anthropology, biology, and so on. So I think the kind of this term new media is a little bit kind of dated and discarded, where this term techno-scientific artist still seems fresh and relevant. But again, they're just these labels that for me personally, I don't put a lot of kind of stock into.
Mm-hmm.
Sorry if that didn't really answer your question.
No, it's okay. My reason for asking it, without getting too deeply into the theory, is I was interested in the intellectual currents of the time, because so many of the artists that are, at least what I understand to be part of this milieu, are heavily involved and are heavily interested in Latour, and I know Latour is using that term. And so I was curious if it had a very specific technical meaning that artists were using, rather than just saying, I'm an artist who uses science in my work, or I'm an artist and scientist, or artist and engineer.
Right. Well, I guess it would be that critique of the scientific method and the objectivity and the like trying to expose what it is that science does from kind of the inside out, from inside the lab and out into the world. It's not, that would be, I have not participated in kind of adapting or championing that label personally. So I don't know if Antoinette or Robert want to speak to that.
It's not a term I've used particularly, although the techno prefix has been of more interest to me, because it is something I have perceived that too much of the art world has tried to pull itself onto an island, the island of the handmade, and keep itself there, even if the handmade can now extend to things like large scale earthworks. And there's been a sort of a general rejection of the industrial, technical, as things machines do, and somehow anti-artistic in various ways. You could see it in the 1,000 different ways that new media art, so-called, which of course we can agree, I think, is a terrible term. But the kinds of practices that fell under that umbrella and similar ones were being roundly rejected. And to this day, you still have artists who will not deal with work of that kind, or the current, not to get too much off on a tangent, but the current way to beat this kind of work with a stick is to sneer at NFTs, my personal opinion. So I think that the word has got a lot of strategic power vis-a-vis the world of art, not just vis-a-vis the world of research and science. For my own purposes, I prefer to call myself an experimentalist, because I find that leaves a kind of a slightly more open terrain with slightly fewer expectations than words like researcher do. And I'm also, frankly, a little tired of the, what is it now, 20 years of arguing over art-based research and research-based art. So I find the term experimentalist suits what I do better.
Mm-hmm. Robert, did you wanted to chime in on that? Because I can also move on to the next topic. I'm going to sort of shift gears here, because prior to this, I wanted to move into thinking about making either, if we'll term it, purely creative work or research or experimentalism, and the implications of making that public. I wanted to pivot into preemptive media, but I think it's actually better here to pivot into talking about the ACE program, and thinking about making this kind of work accessible to the expert and layman, of which Brooke has written extensively, and we'll get to that. But I wanted to sort of discuss some of the challenges of working across departments that Robert, you encountered while serving as a core faculty member and then directing the ACE program. And you had already sort of begun to introduce this with some of the terms that Simon Penny would use to describe what you were doing. But I was shocked to learn that the interest where this actually began in the sciences. You would think it would be the other way around. So I'm curious to know, what did they see in the art program that couldn't be nurtured or cultivated within their own departments?
That's an interesting question, Andrew. And Antoinette, I don't know if you have any insight. this too, because you were there shortly after me and knew Jill, and I don't know if you remember the Dean of Engineering at the time, Nick. And I really think it wasn't that formulated initially. It was just kind of, hey, I've got this FTE and it'd be kind of cool to do something between engineering and the arts. And Jill Beck was, you know, I mentioned she was quite a go-getter and successful at kind of establishing the arts and what it was doing on campus and bringing in support. And she was actually one of the driving forces behind the Beal Center for Art and Technology at UC Irvine, which, you know, no one ever thought would end up in the arts because it was a gift from, correct me if I'm wrong, I think it was the Rockwell Corporation, Antoinette, is that right? The former CEO, whose wife was really into the arts and wanted to do something. And so they had a competition. It was on a scale of, it was a multi-million-dollar competition. And Jill was very aggressively sort of writing proposals saying it belonged in the arts and this kind of nexus of art and technology. And it was a little bit of the zeitgeist of the times. I mean, I think it still is to a certain extent, where a lot of administrators at research universities that are, and art departments are one of the hubs where this happened, embracing kind of creativity that involves technology and seeing it as a potential kind of revenue stream for schools, without going too far down that path. You know, I mean, in the University of California system, as I recall, you know, it was a 10 campus system. It was very large. It had the office of the president at the statewide level. And maybe 20 something percent, 24, 25% of the funding for the campus came from the state, and a lot was from other sources, but a disproportionate amount of that funding was used to kind of keep humanities, social science, and art programs running because they just weren't capable of bringing in a lot of the large scale grants that the sciences and other places on campus were. As part of, you know, what faculty did. It's still a struggle, of course, in this country to find serious funding for arts. And so, yeah, I think the Dean of the School of the Arts was, you know, she had a vision and she was forward thinking with regard to some of this, but also saw it as an opportunity to try and leverage and bringing additional support. And so when Simon came to campus, you know, they didn't know what they were going to get programmatically. It was just, you know, okay, we'll hire a person that can start something interesting between the arts and sciences. And because of that history, we talked a little about at CMU and the people, really interesting mix of people and experiences. That was kind of the genesis of thinking about, okay, I could go on and on. I don't want to do that. It would bore people to tears, but it was very complicated. It was a very difficult, but very interesting program. You know, it started, I think Simon was hired 2003, if I'm not mistaken, 2002, 2003. Beatrice came maybe the following year with Bill. And it took about a year to kind of draft things and get it off the ground, but it ended up being split between 3 different schools administratively. So there's a School of Engineering, the School of the Arts, and the School of Computer Science. And I think it was a model that should never be emulated, but it would basically rotate between the 3 schools to administer the program. And I think, you know, to Simon's credit, he was the kind of big vision person to come in and get something like this going. Maybe not necessarily the best person to kind of manage day-to-day operations of a very complex program split between 3, you know, you end up burning a lot of bridges no matter who you are, because it's just, you know, lots of reasons why that's very difficult to do, and very difficult for young faculty who are split between these schools, needing to go up for merit and promotion and tenure eventually in multiple departments, you know, so handling cases that not only have to kind of pass one department, but also another in a completely different culture. There were a lot of challenges, and it had a very, I think important, significant kind of run as a program, but it no longer exists, you know, so at the end of the day, There was a big 2008 kind of budget crisis. The schools, the whole state, right, was like 20-some billion in debt for the next 5 years. And so there was a big cost cutting happening on campus. And around that time, ACE was still kind of the low-hanging fruit in terms of it being a new program. So everyone recognized, I think there were really interesting students and interesting stuff coming out of it, and the faculty that were participating, you know, it was exciting. But it was like really complicated and troublesome administratively. And, you know, we were right at the cusp of departmentalizing. Like at that time, I had kind of been doing a lot of work as co-director with Simon and then directing for a short period where we'd gone through all of the different committees to try and institutionalize it, because we realized it just wasn't sustainable split between these three schools. And it just required kind of the high level vice chancellor, whoever, to sign off. And then the budget kind of just got decimated, and we were under the control of the School of Computer Science at that time, and they had $1 million hit on their annual budget, and we were about a $250,000 proposition annually. And so they were like, well, you know, you have the decision, the option, you can continue as a program, but you'll be unfunded, or you know, just figure out what you do. And so we collectively decided that, you know, it had run its course. We couldn't really sustain it without any funding and support. And so then there was a process that began of thinking about, okay, well, we have these faculty. Simon and Beatrice were both split 50-50 between the School of Engineering and the School of Art. Bill was split 50-50 between ICS, the Information and Computer Science, and I don't even remember if the other 50% may have been art. I think it was
drama.
Actually. I think it was different drama. You know, he ended up, because he'd done like animation work, that somehow it was more political who got kind of situated where. Like Bill was just like, well, would you be comfortable in drama? You've done stuff that involves, I don't know, things moving in time and space. And he was like, yeah, okay. Anyway, he ended up going full into computer science, and then both Beatrice and Simon came into the School of the Arts. And I remember having conversations when it was all over, collectively thinking, you know, in terms of the interdisciplinarity, and I'd experienced this a lot in my career, different points in time and places, where there's a lot of genuine goodwill and interest in doing interdisciplinary programs, but often not kind of the institutional mechanisms to really support them in a robust way when it comes to cross-listing courses, co-teaching courses, you know, all the same kind of bureaucratic administrative stuff a lot of us working in the academy are very familiar with. And ACE, you know, was certainly right, more so than a lot of programs in the mix of that. And we thought, ironically, it would probably be, there'd be a lot more potential to work in a truly kind of open interdisciplinary fashion, grounded in a particular school or discipline, and then reaching back out, you know. So, and a number of the faculty thought, you know, going from the arts back out, if we ever had the energy to try and rebuild another program similar to ACE, would be the way to go. But yeah, that was.
I'm curious to know, though, if you could just paint a picture in a general sense, bringing in, you know, it's one thing for the odd computer science undergraduate student to take an art class, but to bring in a critical mass of engineers into an arts curriculum, how did that change the arts education?
Well, there were a certain number of students that were allowed to apply within the three different schools that would then be in the ACE program. So you could have students coming in through engineering or computer science or art. And I don't know that I'll really directly address this. It's kind of a roundabout way. So, you know, we'd be trying to balance the number of students with their backgrounds and just kind of look at the creative work they've done, the scientific engineering work that they've done, and their statements and everything else, to bring them into the program and see if they had, you know, potential to really, yeah, if they were just a good fit. And I think we actually found that it was, in a very general sense, a little bit easier for those with strong backgrounds. Well, we'll probably have mixed opinion about this. Sometimes it seemed easier for those with strong backgrounds in sciences and engineering to kind of pick up some of the artwork in creative ways, but often not. So there was a kind of general retooling and coursework that people would have to do to kind of catch up, get up to speed, start to have, interesting, stimulating conversations in those. And it was just a 2-year program, so it had to happen very fast. It was maybe a little overly ambitious in terms of how it was architected, because I think it was asking a little bit much of the students. That needed to be a 3-year program, or potentially we were eventually planning to work toward a PhD program, because I think when Brooke was mentioning it, a lot of these, not a lot, but a number of PhD programs have emerged in the arts, especially in arts departments that have an interest in kind of interdisciplinary work that spans arts and sciences, arts and technology, and feel like that kind of work really can benefit from taking it all the way to the doctorate, where you kind of try and situate your practice historically. You think about, a lot of the sort of trying to write and reflect on key influences and practices that inform the work that you do, and just develop the kinds of techniques and skills that you need in order to produce work that's part of at least partly a practice-based kind of PhD program, and that's really demanding. And I think, Simon was a bit of a taskmaster and really demanding in terms of what he wanted those students to be able to experience. So they came in, and it was, I probably shouldn't even disclose this, but it was such a stress environment in a really highly productive way. There was amazing work some of those students were doing in a short period, but I just remember sitting in multiple defenses where students would just break down in tears because it was just so much, so intense, and we would, it was tough. But
were they breaking down in tears? Were they breaking down in
not
tears?
Not of joy.
Oh, no, but were they breaking down in tears because of the pressures of being under scrutiny, the kind of pressures that artists face as very public-facing individuals, or was it for other reasons?
Yeah, I think it's partly that. It was, they put themselves under such pressure to kind of just bring the work to a point where it felt like it had culminated in something. And a lot of times it's easy to overlook how much time and effort and blood, sweat, and tears it takes to just sort of bring something that on the face of it may seem rather simple if you're not really aware of the process that it might take to get it there, dealing with, various software, hardware, whatever technical systems that you're trying to master and to use in creative and unexpected, unorthodox ways, and merge with some kind of critical, framing that you're doing of the work, and putting it out in the public and having it ready for a public to kind of receive it. And so in a defense where you have a couple hours and you're, drilling down, asking hard questions. Well, why did you do this? And did you ever think about this? And maybe why didn't you do that? And maybe tending to focus on what can easily be perceived as a more negative line of questioning instead of really acknowledging a lot of the difficult work that goes into it. I think all of that sort of can mix together and just be really emotional at the end of, it's a really intensive kind of period. So, we were conscious of it, and we worked through it, but it was a bit of a pressure cooker.
Well, I'm gonna transition really into my final point. I actually want to combine two ideas here. I want to read another passage from Beatriz's essay, and I want to think about this also in relationship to Beatriz's work of preemptive media, combining two ideas, making this sort of work both a spectacle on the one hand, and then also participatory on the other, and the implications of that. Preemptive media work is very participatory. It's interesting, again, for me, about asking this question of what does it mean to make this kind of stuff public, and thinking about how do we relate to this kind of work. So I'm going to read this passage, the reason I want to read this is, I should also note, is that one of our members, Steve, who I'm not sure is here today, from last time, he had raised this point when reading Beatriz's essay about the way that scientific research forecloses upon certain types of actions in the way that it's presented to the public. So Beatriz writes in Reaching the Limit, with homing pigeons serving as the quote reporters of current air pollution levels, Pigeon Blog attempted to create a spectacle provocative enough to spark people's imagination and interest in the types of action that could be taken to reverse this situation. In this situation she's referring to, of course, is climate change. Activists' pursuits, well, it's actually ozone layer change, but activist pursuits can often have a normalizing effect rather than one that inspires social change. Circulating information, quote, how bad things are, can easily be lost in our daily information overload. It seems that artists are in the perfect position to invent new ways in which information is conveyed and participation is inspired. The pigeons became my communicative objects in this project and quote unquote collaborators in the co-production of knowledge. And so to this, Steve, one of our members, noted and commented that the paradox of much environmental research is that it tends to discourage public participation. He wrote that seeing a constant barrage of doom and gloom reports about climate change, quote, eventually takes any seriousness or weight from the claim in the general public when they see that they can keep going on with their lives unchanged, end quote. And so this really made me think of the work that Beatriz was doing with preemptive media, which for the reason that what was very clear from the vantage point of the present is that preemptive media's worked, air, zapped, particularly swipe and zapped, really anticipate our present reality of data mining, data warehousing, and constant surveillance on social media. Either with regards to zapped, which focused on the RFID chip, if I'm not mistaken, and swipe, which focused on the kind of information that is present on someone's state-issued ID that had been increasingly sort of just procedurally swiped by a bartender in order to verify someone's age. But then that information would be aggregated and sold to data warehouses. And this is something that was, I guess, not popularly known at the time. So Brooke, I was hoping that you could talk a little bit about the role of participation in preemptive media's work and also the historical context in which this work was being developed.
Yeah, sure. So all three of those works and the three works that preemptive media made in that time span, starting with swipe and then zapped, as you said, and finally with air, were kind of performative / participatory. So there was this like spectacle aspect that Shani talks about that was very kind of apparent with the Pigeon blog. So that kind of, thing that just makes someone want to know more and, grabs your attention and pulls you in. But we called this mediagenic. I think that's a term Natalie Jeremijenko was using at the time. But this idea that we could use the news outlets and media, obviously before social media, and we didn't have the means to kind of be a PR engine on our own, but how could we use those media channels to get the images and the ideas out there into a general public that is beyond our immediate audience? So that was always something we talked about. But then there's this idea of the workshop and kind of hands-on participatory actions that were attached to each of those projects. So with Swipe, we performed as bartenders, and there was this moment we would demand people's license to get a drink. We were in, kind of a gallery opening situation where you would get a drink. You weren't usually carded, but we said it was museum gallery policy. And in the time that it took us to mix your fancy cocktail, we would have had swiped the magnetic strip on the back of the license, which was a technology at the time, performed data matching. So we had databases that we had accessed, bought information from in the area, did data matching. That was kind of like demographics, census data, along with the individualized data on the license. And Jamie, this was pre Google Maps, and Jamie, with his GIS background, was able to on the fly create a map of where you lived and pinpoint you on this like crude map, with street names and so forth. So the aha moment was you got your drink and you got your personalized data receipt back, and you were like, how did that happen? What was going on? But it didn't end there. So we made the swipe toolkit online, and also in a workshop form. People, we do this at various places to kind of look into, we'd have a card reader, people would look into what information was encoded on your driver's license. Of course, a lot of times it was just inaccurate and funny. But I think, this idea, the kind of this question that Steve raises is really interesting. This when we're talking about climate or talking about these big issues, and okay, there's a lot of data out there and it's being, without my notification or consent, it's being taken from me and it could possibly be sold and used. And this is where the preemptive came from. There's a database at a state, liquor control center. So it knows my habits of buying alcohol in a state-run liquor store. And then I get into a car accident and they can look at that data that was preemptively stored in case there was some sort of criminal event. And then it could check my purchasing habits and so forth. And this was something that actually happened to me in Pittsburgh, buying a bottle of alcohol. Like, I was carded, my license was swiped. I realized, that now this was like an automatic way of verifying my age, but also realized it was an automatic way of collecting my data. And sure enough, that's exactly what was happening. So I think with air, handing out air monitoring devices in Lower Manhattan, our desire was to enter the conversation about harmful air pollution. It was, Lower Manhattan post 9/11. There was no language around air quality, and this was very obvious, within days of the Twin Towers falling and Christine Todd Whitman under pressure from Giuliani and Bush to say the air is safe to breathe and the water is safe to drink, which was, of course, a huge lie. And so we wanted to enter into the conversation to develop a vocabulary about different air pollutants. We were not testing for World Trade Center dust or anything that, actually quite difficult and entails a lot more tools than we had, but we were testing for ground level ozone and NOx and carbon monoxide. And so even like entering that conversation, and in a kind of hand off these devices where people would pick them up at a storefront in Lower Manhattan, there's that moment of contact of having a conversation and discussing issues, whatever they may be. And people were taking the devices to where they wanted to go. A lot of times people were taking them into their neighborhoods or commutes where there weren't static city-run air monitoring devices. So it was that much higher resolution. It was also a resolution of an area that had, interest to you. And for me personally, in my work, there was actually a very kind of conscious move towards not only pointing out the doom and gloom and building a vocabulary around these things that we found problematic and oppressive or detrimental to kind of democratic life or human health, but imagining a future that we wanted to go towards. So my experience with preemptive media actually pushed me to do just that in my more current work of thinking about kind of places we want to go, and maybe solutions or other ways of working that create the kind of positive imaginary space rather than exposing what's wrong and why and how. So I think that that comment from Steve is quite insightful or important. But the participatory aspect was always about developing those conversations in person and from experience of using a tool or through a process that we a performance or process that we invented that was very different, that countered the kind of unidirectional spectacle that was kind of enacted in the media.
And just to amplify that point, and so one of the reasons why I picked this out and I wanted to link it to Preemptive Media's work is because I think it's really a site in which all of these concerns kind of come together. And in thinking about the value of the arts to the sciences, really on this granular level of level of participation, it's not just making people feel included, but precisely what you're talking about is developing a language. You're developing the tools or the skill set to make people feel empowered so that they are not paralyzed in the face of either the challenges or the data or the discourse, and so they actually feel engaged. And that seems like a big component of what Beatrice's commitments were, in addition to Preemptive Media.
Yeah, I think language is a big part of it, and kind of taking hold of that language and making it one's own and understanding it through doing, rather than like, written translation or this means that, right? This AIDC acronym means so-and-so, like where is it happening and how am I involved? I think, it's interesting because the AIR project did not get as much media or attention as Pigeon Blog. It was not as much of a spectacle, but I think it answered a lot of the questions or provided a lot of, they were simultaneous projects that shared technology, and we developed them together as a collaborative. And I think that some of the questions and things that Shani ran into and thought were shortcomings with Pigeon Blog actually worked very elegantly with AIR, and AIR kind of failed in terms of not creating more kind of attention and media spectacle that Pigeon Blog did like so successfully. So it would have been interesting, like, to figure out how to have made that one project that did all these things together, which maybe is not possible. I don't know. But the workshop part of AIR, like when we went to Brazil, that flight that Shani missed and then joined me a couple of days later, we had this amazing workshop where we would sit around, and the AIR device was basically, what was on the backs of the pigeons, but it's in this handheld device with a small monitor readout. And we would talk about where that we had several of them, and we talk about in the group where people wanted to take the devices, the AIR devices, to monitor, common air pollutants on the ground. And one participant, and it was Belo Horizonte, and one participant wanted to go to this carport that was above a market. And her feeling was that the pollution in the enclosed carport was, going down into the entranceway into the market and contaminating the food. And so we went there and we read the levels, and they were quite high in the carport. And there was someone sitting there collecting tickets for 12 hours, 8 hours a day. And that became our discussion of that person's health is impacted by sitting in this environment for such a long period of time. But actually the levels downstairs and around the food were negligible and not an issue. So, it's this kind of thing of like thinking, what are these pollutants? Where do they come from? Where do we fear that they are and impacting the health of our community or ourselves, and then testing it, going there and looking at it and kind of thinking about your experience and looking at the data and, you know, having that as a conversation to work through, I thought was quite, you know, successful. Yeah.
Sorry, I was muted.
Were you speaking?
Yeah, I was speaking. But, so we have about 20 minutes left. I want to open it up and see if anyone from the study group or newcomers have a question for or a comment for our three guests.
I'm here, by the way. Steve.
Ah, Steve. Excellent. Good to see you.
Yeah, I was here all this time. I was in the forest and then I was driving, so I didn't have my camera on, but I've been listening.
No worries. Thank you for joining us from the forest. That's pretty wild. So
I do have a question. Sorry, Andrew. Thank you again for all these awesome insights about Beatriz's work. I actually want to ask about the idea of autonomy, because that's something that I have been working for a long time in my own work, and that's something that also I found very interesting in Pigeon blog, in terms of like how to create your own data, how to collect your own data in benefit of a specific group. I know like Pigeon blog never end being like a project that was delivered to a specific community, but I really imagine that process. It helps me really imagine that process of like, you know, in putting in the same platform science, but also you know, the pigeon fanciers, the actual pigeons are our collaborators, as Anu well mentioned, and you know, but also like how Beatriz was super involved. Well, like all her knowledge came from, or most of her knowledge came from the university and from all these collaborations. And you know, also talking about science, it makes me think a lot about like the knowledge of the community and how we can use that also in this type of art projects. And I guess like my question is like to Robert, Antoinette, and Brooke, if they can talk a little bit more about that. One, Robert, I was thinking in the anti-cancer survival kit that also Beatriz developed, and it was this idea of like generate and collect your own information, but also collectively, and then distribute it collectively. So then like that part of like kind of, you know, separating from the big universities, the big institutions, the big hospitals that are doing these researches, and you know, how we can still use tools from there, but have our own autonomous projects. And also like Antoinette, you working inside a university, how the birds are getting crazy here. How you can separate also, you know, being inside an institution, and how you, like sometimes when we are inside institutions can absorb us a lot, in how we can separate our critical thinking. And Brooke, I was just thinking also on the sponge carbon project that you have, and something that I read that you were saying, we are not sending, we're like the soil to the laboratory. We're bringing the laboratory into the community to learn and have that access. So I don't know if you all can talk about that.
I'll start. That was a complicated question, actually. There's a lot of pieces in it. I would say that all of us in the university who are artists are somewhat compromised by that, in the sense that we have comfortable lives, securer lives than most artists, and have to negotiate the institution and all of its risks. And at the same time, most of us don't have very good funding, so we spend all our time scrambling for stuff to put projects together. And particularly in techno-scientific art, the funding is nowhere near what is needed to do the projects at the scale they need to be done. One of the things I've noticed is that over the last 10 years, a lot of my best students are trying to do work in this kind of area, broadly designated, working on developing research around ecological projects or scientific projects or speculative design projects, however they form them. They want to work and they reach out across campus, and they can never find people who really want to work with them, because the artists are seen as essentially taking time away from the laboratory and giving nothing in return that's valuable. Because even if I gave people a credit, some kind of academic credit, they don't need it. And everybody is very focused on getting their next job in a world where these jobs are vastly diminished and receding every year. So it's not like I can fault anybody for careerism, but what happens is these ambitious art students come back. They stop trying to work with the biologists or the chemists or the scientists, and they start trying to figure out how to do bricolage on their own, research on their own. So they scale the project down, they move it into tools they can learn quicker or learn on their own, or partner in other ways. So on the one hand, it rewards creative rethinking, but on the other hand, it is unquestionably an obstacle. And it is one of the things that shows that Shani and Simon Penny, for that matter, is a rare person. It's a rare person who can find the collaborators and learn enough fast enough to carry off these projects. Brooke must be the same kind of person too, to actually be able to carry them off within time scales where, for example, people need to get promotions. You can't have projects that are too slow. I mean, it would be ideal perhaps to have a 10-year project. You don't get to do that inside the university. So there are so many institutional obstacles, as well as the simple problem of expertise. I don't have any good solution for how you do it, how you go and figure out a process on your own. And I don't know that there is a blanket solution for any of this, but I do see that it is creating issues for students. And one of the things that was good about the ACE program is that it mandated, in effect, that students could work in all three areas and would get supported to work in all three areas and wouldn't be shoved back by people in engineering towards the arts, or people in arts towards engineering. That there was expertise that could feed the students from the main faculty of the ACE program, as well as adjunct faculty or affiliated faculty, I think is what people like me were actually called. Yeah.
Is there any more questions?
Robert, do you want to say something?
I don't think I can speak to the question of autonomy in quite the way that it sounds like you were interested in, Daniela. I mean, it's complicated, it's tricky. And I was just echoing a lot of what Antoinette said. I mean, that percolated all the way up as I kind of referenced to, merit and tenure promotion cases where, literally I remember someone who was split between arts and engineering. This case I was handling, he presented in the arts, and it was primarily a kind of arts centric case. So the faculty could have intelligent conversation about it. You could go through the process, the kind of institutional process for advancement in a fairly kind of logical way. And then when it went over to engineering, big faculty, 30 maybe people around the room, and presenting the case, having to try and find a language to kind of situate the work and talk about it, but still just real no, very different culture, real no understanding of the value of the work, what it added, what it contributed, why the faculty of engineering should even participate in the ACE program. In fact, a couple of the And it would be like the strength of the dean saying, well, this is just a program that we kind of collectively decided we're going to support. And if the arts department merits this, then, you know, I think we should merit it. You take a vote, it either passes or it doesn't. But two of the, you know, both junior faculty from the engineering side that were the strongest affiliates with the ACE program and dedicating a lot of their time and really important to the students, great engineers, in a school where the dean wanted a program like this to happen, were denied tenure and went elsewhere, one to private industry and another to a different UC campus. So it's really tricky, kind of challenging stuff. In terms of process, listening, when I was listening to Antoinette, like one of the things I always really respected about Beatrice, and which was so different from my own process, was her ability. I mean, she was someone who lived with a sense of very little time. She had this impending feeling she would, you know, die young, get sick again, just because of her history with cancer and illness. So it's kind of a different time scale that she lived on compared to a lot of us, I think, and a kind of intensity and focus and drive that motivated a lot of that 150% toward work, you know, because that was where she was really, that was the hardest thing for me when she passed, was just kind of not being able to see what, you know, was going to come next, and unrealized projects, you know, because she had a real gift and talent for that kind of work. But you know, her process was very methodical, where she was very insular and quiet. Like, she wouldn't really talk much about a lot of the things that she was developing while she was developing them. And she would kind of schedule them out, and she'd have an idea of where she would want to get to with something. And then it seemed to me, kind of observing, that she would just execute on that. And, you know, what she would end up with at the end of the day is kind of what she had planned for from the very start. And again, for me, that's just such a foreign. I like meander around and try and make sense of things that I do for ages after they're done. So yeah, she, you know, in terms of that, was quite focused. Again, this doesn't really have any kind of segue back into your initial kind of question about autonomy, Daniela. But
I just wanted to jump in and add that, you know, where I teach, it's not a research university, and it's actually more of an arts campus and small liberal arts college. And I'm collaborating with scientists that are outside of my home institution. And I, you know, initially went up to a couple of scientists who I respect and have been following for a while after a panel, and introduced myself and started a conversation. I found, you know, I'm an established artist who have a track record with this. So I'm not myself an undergrad or a graduate student. So I think there's something too about younger artists doing more maybe speculative, you know, design projects and thinking through ideas more rapidly until they find that collaborator who is open. It's really a person-to-person thing. But I have found that more recently, a lot more scientists are open to these collaborations because they see many more examples of them that are successful and enticing. And especially with climate science, there is a sense of urgency and realization that science cannot do it all. And science has done what it can in many regards in terms of moving us towards kind of a more sustainable and optimistic future. But, you know, I've just with, you know, it's anecdotal, but I have found that there are a lot more open scientists. You have to find ones who are not maybe 100% careerists or feel very secure in where they are and have gotten a lot of notoriety and don't have a lot to prove, perhaps. But anyway, there are lots of tricks and kind of lessons I've learned through forging these collaborations. So if that is of interest to anyone, I'm happy to share that more later, since I know that we're coming close to the end of time here.
Can I just follow up with a very quick observation about this question that came up earlier of whether the work has impact and how it reaches the public? A lot of art as in other things in late capitalism, has a presentist bias. You're supposed to be part of the zeitgeist now, or if you don't, you're basically out of the swim. Your time has passed, nothing happens. There's another kind of work which I think sits around like and goes off 10 years later, has a delayed impact. And I noticed that, again, this generation of students is very concerned with exactly these kinds of issues that Brooke just outlined. And they're looking back at models like Shawnee's for the work that they're inspired by. And it's a whole new generation of people making this kind of work, trying to get it out to the public. So it's like the wave has gotten bigger. Parts of the public that work reaches has gotten bigger. A lot of the public will still be discouraged and not do anything about anything. But it is that question of how, especially in a democracy, things build slowly over time. And it's heartening when work of this kind does have, in a way, a second life. And I do think that that's one of the things that I see happening, not to her work alone, but also to other people working, over the last 50 years who have been addressing these kinds of issues.
We have 4 minutes left. Does anybody want to raise any further questions or comments? Unfortunately, this is not like one of our typical sessions where I just get to call on people.
Should I jump in, or is somebody else jumping in?
Oh yeah, sorry, I don't. Anu, go ahead.
Oh, I was really interested in these questions about why are we revisiting this now? I mean, again, I'm sure people who are involved in the Getty PST Art and Science Initiative have already heard me say this many, many times, but I started out my career working primarily as an art and science curator. And it was through that I was able to have the privilege of working with Beatriz. I subsequently really stepped away from that space, not so much as a critic, but very much so as a curator for many years, because there ceased to be much support for it outside of academic institutions. Recently, there's been a sudden uptick in support, which is very exciting and great. And for example, NFTs, as complicated as they are, have been really great for certain established digital artists who already have bona fides in the space, but never really had much of a collector base to actually access that degree of financial support for their work and institutional support for their work sometime for the first time. And that's extremely promising. And I would like to point out that even the fact that the Getty is funding an initiative like this art science initiative that allows us to be here today is a huge leap from where they were in Beatriz's lifetime, which was, again, only 10 years ago, cut short. So I really wish that she was here today to get that kind of support and be here for it. I'm so glad that this is happening. But it does make me sad that she's not here to be celebrated. Not that she would really have let us celebrate her. Anyway, she would have been far too modest.
Thank you for that, Anu. All right, we're 2 minutes out. So I want to make a brief announcement for those of you who I will see 2 weeks from now. There is a slight change to the itinerary for the readings, so please pay attention to the email. The great news is it's less reading. The bad news is there's more articles. I'm not sure, but it will be a broad overview of symbiotic, participatory, research-oriented scientific art, written by that was recently published and brought to my attention, written by another longtime collaborator of Beatriz's, Claire Pentecost, who coined the term public amateurism that is part of the subtitle of this study group. So I'm very excited to read it with you and discuss it with you all. And again, I want to extend a huge thank you to Brooke, Robert, and Antoinette for joining us today. This has been an extraordinary conversation that has given us a lot of texture and understanding what kind of person Beatriz is and was. So thank you.
Thanks for inviting us. And by the way, Claire's article in Tactical Biopolitics is really good. I don't know if that's one of the ones you have on the list.
I assign it every semester for my students. I love that chapter. It's great.
It might be for session 2. We'll see.
Optional read.
Optional read. It's definitely in the supplementary reading. All right, thank you, everyone.
I'm just quickly, I'm not sure, Brooke, how earnest that offer was. That's a very kind offer to share tricks. I would be happy to reach out to you another time, but
it was totally genuine.
Well, thank you.
Absolutely. I just put my email address in the chat, or you could get it from Daniela. I'd be happy to speak.
Thank you so much, everyone.
All right.
And thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Until next time.
Robert, Antoinette, Brooke.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Sandra.